I should have ignored the road sign. I don't even know why I paid it any attention. Just one of those weather-worn markers, half shrouded in creeping ivy. The letters chipped and faintly reflective in the headlights. It read, "Welcome to Grayson's Hollow." Innocuous enough, sure, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. Maybe it was the way the fog hung thicker beyond the sign, swallowing everything in its milky folds. Or perhaps it was the wrongness of the road ahead, a narrow strip of cracked asphalt slithering like a snake into the unknown. The dashboard clock blinked 11:47 p.m., its unholy red glow taunting me. I was late. Again. The client meeting in Charleston was already a bust, another no-show to add to the growing pile of failures in my dwindling career. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles whitening, and told myself I'd push through the fog, get back on the interstate, and make it to the next town before the car's sputtering engine gave up completely. Instead, the engine decided for me. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. A cough here, a wheeze there, but then, with a violent shudder that seemed to vibrate through my very bones, the car rolled to a reluctant stop. I twisted the key in the ignition again and again, each click dragging me closer to the realization I'd been dreading. I wasn't going anywhere. The silence that followed was suffocating. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just the eerie quiet of the fog-blanketed night. I stepped out, slamming the door harder than I meant to, hoping to summon some noise, some life, but the sound barely echoed before the fog devoured it whole. And that's when I saw the lights. Dim, flickering, and low to the ground, they appeared through the haze about 50 yards ahead. Streetlights, maybe? A town? Relief coursed through me, warming my cold hands as I grabbed my briefcase from the passenger seat. I didn't stop to wonder why I hadn't seen the lights earlier. Grayson's Hollow felt like a place that shouldn't exist. The buildings that lined the main street had the unmistakable air of abandonment. Wooden shutters sagged on rusted hinges, doors leaned open at precarious angles, and the paint on the walls had long since surrendered to time and weather. Yet, strangely, the streetlights were intact, casting their dim, yellowed glow over the eerily pristine cobblestone streets. No graffiti, no weeds, no signs of the life or decay you'd expect in a place forgotten by the world. I moved down the street, my footsteps echoing louder than they should in the oppressive stillness. "Hello? Anyone here?" The words left my throat dry and cracked, barely carrying past the fog. But then I saw him. Or rather, it. A man sat slumped on a bench just ahead, his shoulders hunched and head bowed as if asleep. Relief rushed over me, and I quickened my pace, but as I got closer, something felt off. His posture was too stiff, his clothes too clean, like he was part of some elaborate mannequin display, and then he turned his head. I froze. My stomach dropped. The man, he looked familiar. The salt and pepper hair, the wire-framed glasses perched on a crooked nose. My high school biology teacher, Mr. Clark. Mr. Clark? I stammered, my voice cracking with disbelief. He didn't answer right away. He just smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that stretched too wide. "David," he said, his voice then dry and cracked, as though he hadn't spoken in years. "Welcome back." I backed away from the bench, my heart hammering in my chest. Welcome back? No, this wasn't right. Clark had died years ago. Some freak accident involving his car and a runaway semi. I'd attended the funeral, stood next to my classmates in the rain, and watched his casket sink into the mud. Yet here he was, sitting under a street lamp, smiling like nothing had happened. My pulse quickened as I turned and stumbled further into the town. I needed to find someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. But the deeper I ventured into Grayson's Hollow, the stranger it became. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, flickering just out of sight. The fog seemed to breathe, ebbing and flowing like a living thing. And then there were the faces, familiar faces, all of them. I spotted Mrs. Hargrove, the cashier from the corner store in my hometown, always with a pencil tucked behind her ear and a conspiratorial smirk. I saw Benny from 3rd grade, his overalls just as ragged as I remembered, despite the 30 years that had passed since I'd last seen him. I even saw Elena, sweet, shy Elena, standing outside what looked like a diner, her blonde hair glowing like a halo in the streetlight. Her eyes met mine, and I froze. She shouldn't have been here. She shouldn't have been anywhere. I'd buried her myself. "David," she called, her voice soft and melodic. "It's so good to see you." "No," I whispered, shaking my head as I stumbled backward. You're not real." Her face twisted into something like pity, or was it regret? "Why do you always say that?" she asked, taking a step toward me. "Why do you always run?" I turned and bolted. The fog seemed thicker now, clinging to me like cold hands as I ran blindly through the streets. The buildings loomed like giants, their windows dark and staring. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as the faces kept appearing. Familiar, smiling faces, all calling my name. Their voices echoed with a strange, hollow quality, like they were speaking from underwater. I didn't stop until I reached the church at the end of the street. Its steeple rose into the fog like a skeletal finger, the wooden doors slightly ajar. I pushed inside without thinking, desperate for sanctuary. The interior was as decrepit as the rest of the town, pews covered in a fine layer of dust, candles melted into unrecognizable lumps. But at least it was quiet. At least I was alone, or so I thought. A figure stood at the altar, cloaked in shadow. I couldn't see their face, but I felt their gaze, piercing, unrelenting. "You came back," the figure said, their voice low and rasping. "I knew you would." "I don't know what's happening," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know who you are, but—" "You do," they interrupted, stepping forward. The light from the stained glass fell across their face, and my knees buckled. It was me. My double stared at me with hollow eyes, his face gaunt and pale. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice heavy with accusation, "but you never could leave well enough alone." "This isn't real," I whispered, clutching at the pew for support. It's the fog. It's a dream." The double's smile was bitter. "You think this is about the fog?" He laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. "No, David. This is about you, about the things you've done, the people you've hurt, the guilt you've tried so hard to bury." I staggered back, shaking my head. "No, I didn't mean to." "You've been running your whole life," the double said, advancing on me. "But this is where it ends. Grayson's Hollow is your reckoning." The walls of the church seemed to close in, the air growing thick and oppressive. The faces from the town appeared in the pews, staring silently. Clark, Hargrove, Benny, Elena, all of them watching, judging. "No," I choked out, my voice barely audible. "I don't belong here, I don't." But the words died in my throat as the double reached out, his hand cold and clammy on my shoulder. "You've always belonged here, David," he whispered. "You just didn't want to admit it." The last thing I saw was his face, grinning as the fog swallowed me whole. And then there was nothing.